Every day, something dramatic happens in the Caribbean that affects our lives. We'll give you the details. We'll give you the facts on Caribbean Perspective with Eddie Frederick. Here's Eddie Frederick.
So glad you can join us. End in sight for pandemic, says World Health Organization. This story takes the lead in today's edition of Caribbean Perspective for Friday, 16th September 2022. Details when we return.
The hurricane season is now upon us, so we as Caribbean people need to remember to think safety and be prepared. Avoid venturing outside during a storm or hurricane, especially if there are strong winds. Rooftops and other debris are often blown about and can cause great damage.
Welcome back. Head of the World Health Organization says the end is in sight for the COVID-19 pandemic as global deaths fall. Dr. Tedros says last week saw the lowest number of reported deaths since March 2020. However, he insists this is no time to relent in the fight against the pandemic.
A marathon runner does not stop when the finish line comes into view. She runs harder with all the energy she has left. So must we. We can see the finish line. We are in a winning position, but now is the worst time to stop running. Now is the time to run harder and make sure we cross the line and reap the rewards.
In other news, a UN climate science report is warning about increased and more intense natural disasters if more decisive action is not taken to reduce fossil fuel emissions and rising greenhouse gases. Don Nicholas of the DBS News World reports.
The researchers behind Uniting in Science, coordinated by the World Meteorological Organization, studied several factors related to the climate crisis, from CO2 emissions, global temperature rises, and extreme weather impacts. The report concluded that far more ambitious action is needed if the increasingly devastating physical and socio-economic effects of climate change on the planet are to be avoided.
Climate action is stalling on key fronts, and the poorest countries and people are being hardest hit. But no country is immune. The report is a shameful reminder that resilience building is the neglected half of the climate equation. It is a scandal that developed countries have failed to take adaptation seriously and shrugged off their commitments to help the developing world. The Glasgow decision urges developed countries to collectively provide $40 billion a year in new adaptation finance, and this must be delivered in full as a starting point. But it is clearly not enough.
Greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise at record highs, and fossil fuel emission rates are now above pre-pandemic levels. In order to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement, namely keeping global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, greenhouse gas emissions reduction pledges need to be 7 times higher, says the report. A possible global climate tipping point could spell disaster with irreversible changes to the climate system. The report says that this cannot be ruled out, as the past 7 years were the warmest on record.
This is a moral imperative, and this is also a matter of common sense. Adaptation investments pay huge human dividends for donors and vulnerable countries, people and communities alike. And yet, most multilateral development banks are not doing enough. G20 countries are their shareholders. The buck stops with them to force the changes needed.
A World Meteorological Organization meeting held in Cairo last week advanced plans to ensure that early warnings reach everyone in the next 5 years. Early warning systems have been recognized as a proven, effective, and feasible climate adaptation measure that saves lives. For the DBS News World, I am Don Nicholas.
Trinidad's Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley attended a hearing of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Financial Services on the impacts of de-risking on banking in the Caribbean on Wednesday, 12th September 2022. Barbados' Prime Minister Mia Mottley gave testimony at the hearing and called on the U.S. to reverse its decision regarding correspondent banking in the region. She said Caribbean leaders are fighting for a global public good and for the human rights of their citizens. She told the legislators that if the U.S. wants to be risk sensitive, then it needs to focus on where the money is rather than creating rules that act as proxy to money laundering or terrorism financing. More in this TTT News item.
You wanted to find the money launderers with respect to Russia, you didn't come to the Caribbean. You went to London, you went to New York, you went to Zurich, you went to Luxembourg. And I say this because there has to be a fundamental injustice in a system that puts on a list not Luxembourg, not the United States of America, not the United Kingdom, but puts Jamaica, Trinidad, Ghana, Barbados.
The committee hearing follows a similar session held earlier this year in Barbados involving the committee's chairman, Maxine Waters, and other U.S. legislators. Prime Minister Rowley also met with Congresswoman Waters on this matter on behalf of CARICOM in September 2019. Prime Minister Mottley said in the Caribbean, foreign investors and locals spend weeks and months trying to open a bank account as individuals to live and as companies to trade in business.
Businesses come into our region sometimes weeks and months just to open a bank account as individuals to live and as companies to trade and do business. Our economies cannot function on their own. We do not make enough clothes, we do not produce our own food, we do not produce our own equipment, and therefore, unless we are able to trade with the rest of the world, we are at risk of becoming financial pariahs.
Prime Minister Rowley, Prime Minister Mottley, and President of Guyana, Dr. Mohamed Irfan Ali, are scheduled to attend a meeting with U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris on Thursday.
You're listening to Caribbean Perspective with Eddie Frederick.
In a Joel Brown exclusive from TV6 News of Trinidad and Tobago, Prime Minister Mia Mottley, in the presence of Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister, also says de-risking is creating a situation that could lead to the very money laundering and financing of terrorism, which the U.S. and governments in the Caribbean want to avoid.
In Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley and Energy Minister Stuart Young were seated behind Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley during her testimony at a hearing of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Financial Services on the impacts of de-risking on banking in the Caribbean.
When we were growing up, opening a bank account was a part of our rites of passage in becoming an adult. Today, it is now a gargantuan obstacle for us to have our people do so, given that we spend weeks and businesses come into our region, sometimes weeks and months, just to open a bank account as individuals to live and as companies to trade and do business.
The World Bank says that smaller countries with limited financial markets are particularly vulnerable to de-risking practices, with evidence of this notably in the Caribbean region.
We, the majority of our countries, also depend on tourism. What happens when your tourists come? What happens when your investors want to build hotels? This is the most nonsensical thing that we have seen in public policy.
The hearing began with a welcome from the committee's chairwoman, Maxine Waters.
Today's testimony by Prime Minister Mottley isn't just timely, it's historic. It marks the first time in nearly 40 years that a Prime Minister will testify before Congress. I'm also pleased to acknowledge Dr. Keith Rowley, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for joining us to lend your support.
Chairwoman Waters described the de-risking as a crisis.
For too long, the lack of financial access faced by Caribbean nations and their majority Black populations has been blatantly ignored. As chairwoman of the committee, and even long before I assumed the chair, I've worked with stakeholders to combat the de-risking we've seen harm businesses and families across the Caribbean and the United States for more than 10 years.
Thank you for having me here. I want to acknowledge my colleague, brother, Prime Minister of Trinidad, the Honorable Keith Rowley, who is also here this morning, and appropriately so, because even though they don't have an offshore banking sector, They are the owners of 2 of the 5 banks in Barbados and therefore have a vested interest in this issue.
Prime Minister Motley said there are 41 states in the United States of America that each have a larger GDP than the collective GDP of US $82 billion of all 15 member states in CARICOM.
Our economies cannot function on their own. We do not make enough clothes, we do not produce our own food, we do not produce our own equipment, and therefore, unless we are able to trade with the rest of the world, we are at risk of becoming financial pariahs.
Prime Minister Motley said almost every state in the Caribbean region over the course of the last decade, with the exception of 2 or 3, have lost over 30% of their correspondent banking relationships.
And therefore, what we face is a situation that the very thing that you set out to achieve, which is the avoidance of terrorism financing, the avoidance of money laundering, on which we are all agreed, is likely to happen because you're driving people underground. There is no benefit in driving our citizens underground or making our countries uncompetitive such that our economies are at risk of becoming underdeveloped or failed states. And we have now to determine whether this is capable of being a continued acceptable course of action.
The Office of the Prime Minister said that in April, Prime Minister Rowley participated in a roundtable discussion on de-risking and correspondent banking in Barbados, which was co-chaired by Prime Minister Motley and Congresswoman Waters in Barbados. Jule Brown, TV6 News.
The governor of the Central Bank of the Bahamas weighs in on the downsizing exercises happening at commercial banks in the country. Carla Palmer of ZNS News has this report.
When asked why some banks might be downsizing or right-sizing and closing branches, most customers do not seem to know. They don't even have a clue.
I have no idea. I'm still trying to figure that out now. They said that it was closing, but they didn't say why.
That's shocking me. I normally stop this area. If I in this area, I'd stop here. Other than that, it was shocking to me.
The Palmdale branch of First Caribbean is the latest banking institution here in New Providence closing its doors. Its last day of operations was August 31st.
I have no idea why they are closing, and I've been getting informed too that I should get an online account to do banking, but I haven't did that as yet because I didn't find the need to.
Although you may be oblivious to the facts, it may surprise you to know that as a customer, you are the reason for the changes taking place. And that's according to Governor of the Central Bank, Mr. John Roll.
It is being driven by the changes in customer behaviors and pattern. Some of those behaviors are being incentivized by the banks, but in general, we have access to more online means of doing banking transactions, making payments and receiving payments, and that has a natural reducing impact on some of the traffic that's being experienced. And so for the banks, from an efficiency point of view, it becomes necessary to reduce the branch network.
Simply put, less people are going into the banks, substantiated by financial trends, which suggests that more of you prefer using your digital devices to conduct your financial transactions from your desktop at work or home, or your laptop from any location, still at your own pace and comfort.
I can assure you that the adjustment that we've been seeing in the branch network for banks in the Bahamas is a process that is more than a decade long in terms of the reduction in the branch footprint. What I think is the complexity is that there isn't that perfect turnover switch in terms of when you decide that the amount of traffic that's happening in branch is not at the level to justify a branch standing on its own, and that's what's happened in many cases. And it's as I said, it's happening also because the institutions are striving to be more efficient in their operations.
With a reported mission to be more efficient in their operations, as the banking regulator, Governor Rowles says, he's cognizant that not everyone is technologically savvy, but he is committed to facilitating public education through financial literacy campaigns. For the Bahamas Tonight, I'm Carla Palmer.
Hubbard's is once again innovating the way you shop with its new online store, providing 24-hour shopping convenience. You can shop now for appliances, hardware, houseware, building material, and more. Free delivery island-wide. Start shopping now at hubbardshardware.gd. Safe, convenient, reliable.
I am Eddie Frederick, wishing you a restful weekend. This has been Caribbean Perspective, a whole new approach to highlighting developments in the Caribbean. In the meantime, please continue to log on to CaribbeanPerspective.com for more daily news and more.